So good morning, everyone. It's Patrick Lovell coming at you on let's see, I guess it's Thursday. I got the day wrong yesterday. Thursday, February 2nd. Can't believe we're in February already. I can't believe we're in 2023. And it's approximately 10 a.m. my time. So, I decided to take another track this morning to kind of fill in some blanks that really is just infuriating when you composite all of this information in context to all of the different nodes of silos of people with different interests and, sort of struggling sort of tactics and strategies and mainstream and things online and the vast array of information, much of which is misinformation. And, I can't think of a better entry point than this, title lock that I came across about a year ago, but I've done a little bit more deep dive on it the last few days, just because I was providing information to people I'm working with, because it's not shocking, but it provides more clarity, I suppose, on kind of a bigger picture. And some of what I'm going to lay on you is theorizing, but most of it is based on fact, and I'll be able to articulate that pretty clearly. But it's just me talking to you. And for those of you listening, the reason you want to listen to this is that um, there's a systemology to what is the nexus of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history that never ended, that constitutes our financial system. And I think if you're rich, if you're in the sort of sphere of business journalism and you wanted good news, yesterday was kind of a day for the bulls where, because of the sort of scope, if you will, of expectations, which is really everything for these like hyena madness of gambling addicts in our financial markets, they all look to the Federal Reserve and, of course, Jerome Powell and where we are and what's going on with interest rates. Because the higher interest rates go, the more expensive it becomes to manage that debt and the less the fees become. And so when interest rates are low, those in the financial system, particularly in real estate, among others, consider it free money. Free money to dabble in a lot of things that we unpack for you in terms of the systemology of the stopgaps in the pipeline and how it can be corrupted to create a fraud machine in our real estate markets. Now, that's first and foremost. Now, this happens in a variety of markets in a variety of ways, as I've mentioned to those who have been paying attention and those who maybe are just now discovering this. I mean, every day we're introduced to another massive fraud somewhere in the world. It's unbelievable that this is really the construct of modern, global economics and finance. Why? Because, years ago we created this sort of systemology of globalism where we're going to manufacture most of our products in Asia based on the non-regulatory structure and the low wage environment and the access to a lot of, I guess, raw materials to be able to build such products in these, what they call supply lines. And of course, those could be disrupted as they were in a massive way during COVID and in the aftermath of COVID, supply chains, as we call them. But that's one side of the house, and that's been evolving over the course of the last many, many decades. And much of our energy, predicated on fossil fuel, is comes from specific areas around the globe, particularly the Middle East and OPEC producing nations, and of course other producers such as Venezuela and Brazil, and and then we're finding throughout the United States, of course, new deposits that we can get to based on fracking technology that didn't exist 20 years ago. That a lot of investment went into that over the course of the last since the 2008 great financial crisis. And the United States has actually become, I think, the leading producer of oil and gas on the planet. And we export a lot of LNG to Europe, which is a big deal because of the war in Ukraine and the I can't remember the name of the huge pipeline from Russia to Germany, but that was sabotaged, and it appears that may have been American forces that were involved with that, which is incredibly important because we've been exporting a lot of liquefied natural gas to Europe this winter. We haven't heard, interestingly enough, being February, I anticipated a lot more inflation and supply chain disruption because of the Ukrainian-Russian war in Ukraine, and some of these other global influences to create real problems in Europe. But I'm not sure. I haven't been following the temperature weather patterns in Europe. We know that in the North America we've had incredible winter caused by the polar vortex and incredible amounts of moisture to the West Coast, which we haven't seen in years. And where I live, the amount of snowfall has been quite extraordinary this year in comparison to like the last, I don't know, 5 to 7 years. I think we've been in a basic drought. California in general has just been in deep trouble for a very long time. But I know the snowpack is incredible throughout the West, as has been the precipitation, which of course has led to a lot of environmental damage. But look, that's just kind of a look at the macro for today. But at the same time, in the confluence of how things are working, but Jerome Powell announced a quarter point increase in the interest rates yesterday, which puts more pressure to so-called manage inflation, through a whole variety of methodologies. And the mandate of the Federal Reserve is to do things that seem rather contradictory, particularly in light of if you just follow their actions versus what they say. You can see this in real time. So the Federal Reserve's mandate is to, above all else, create price stability. Now, they say all the time and repeat, and economists repeat this all the time, that the mandate is to, keep inflation to about 2% and to have full employment. But as we saw inflation increase and they started to increase interest rates, the idea was to nix the, let's say the bubble in employment after COVID. And also a lot of companies were hiring. I presume the connection might be from a lot of free money that went into companies to produce verticals that, they had been sitting idle for, the time period of COVID. And a lot of people supposedly got hired and we had full employment and, the labor market was strong and people were getting paid more because there was more jobs than there were people. So based on supply demand, we had this increase in salaries, and all of that presumably would be good for the economy because when people make more money, they buy more things. But what we had was inflation. Well, from where I was sitting, the inflation was coming from supply chain disruption more than anything, and increased in cost of fossil fuels. And you put those two things together, but then people had more spending capacity, supposedly, presumably. And that helped increase inflation. And we saw, extraordinary things happening in grocery stores over the course of the last, I guess going back to last summer, spring and fall, or summer, fall, and now winter, we saw outrageous costs in the grocery store increase, right? And then fuel costs and that sort of thing. And they're coming down. And so, the bet between the so-called bulls and the bears and the wrestling of, where we're going to go with the markets is always oriented towards the Federal Reserve. And what's Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, going to say to people? And what is he going to project that these gambling addicts in all of our financial markets are gleaning? Now, the one thing that's not part of the main conversation at the moment is quantitative easing and bond purchase programs by the Fed. I know that they were talking about quantitative tightening up until, let's say, as we got into, I guess, fourth quarter, but that conversation seems to have dissipated. And I recall maybe as far back as last summer, I had reached out to a world-renowned economist that I have access to, a guy I respect immeasurably. And I asked him, I said, well, when is the quantitative easing bond purchase programs going to end? And he basically told me never. And I thought that was very telling because, I know for years and years and years, the Fed's been purchasing mortgage-backed securities to the tune of $180 billion per month. That's what is that? That's the government buying the inventory of what the developers and the brokers and everybody in the food chain can produce real estate and sell real estate, to the government. Now, people will argue whether or not the Federal Reserve is the government. Of course, the Federal Reserve was mandated and created by Congress, so it's accountable to Congress, presumably, which I know it's not, based on stuff that I've introduced before, which I'll go into momentarily. But, the idea is that, and this came across in an interview with a congresswoman who's going to run for the Senate, a woman by the name of Katie Porter, who was ushered in as a student of Elizabeth Warren, and she became a congresswoman in California because she was in on cleaning up part of the task force in the fallout of the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, and I believe initially to kind of clean up federal funds to help stabilize the housing market and that sort of thing. And I don't know all the details, but she's a knowledgeable person. But she says in an interview with, I believe, maybe it was Chris Hayes a couple of days ago, but she's talking about two things simultaneously that I thought was very telling. First, they were asking her questions about Congress, the Republicans under Kevin McCarthy and the leadership making a big deal a couple of days ago over fraud based on PPP loans, which was significant. It was absolutely horrific. A lot of theft, and the guys that are involved with the theft seem to be organized crime and a whole lot of downstream effects of the PPP loans. And then I guess it got out there and a lot of people started stealing from PPP loans, particularly white shoe law firms. That plays into what I'm about to unpack for you. But the congresswoman is talking about fraud and saying, yes, we've got to address it and everything. And then she starts talking about the debt ceiling. And then that dovetails into Federal Reserve policy. And she's like, the Federal Reserve has to be independent. This from a woman who's inside, that's all the carnage of all of the disaster of the fraud that was the housing market that the Federal Reserve had to clean up ultimately. But apparently she's not aware of the fraud that dwarfs the fraud she was talking about for PPP loans. Now, is this because she's dumb? Well, I don't think she's dumb. I think she went to Harvard. She studied under Elizabeth Warren, which I'm assuming she knows everything about bankruptcy. And she must have been a star student if she came under the wings of Elizabeth Warren, because Elizabeth Warren is one of the most recognized experts in bankruptcy because of her capacity, and she's been a corporate attorney as well. But then, of course, she comes out of Harvard, taught at Harvard, becomes a senator, and then she's on the boards of a lot of things and was involved with creating Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the reason for that and everything else. And this is what ushers in Katie Porter, and Katie Porter is like, the Fed needs to be independent. No, the Fed doesn't need to be independent. The Fed is independent, and the Fed backstopped illegally trillions upon trillions of dollars to a bankrupt financial fraud, which was this Frankenstein that Wall Street created because of policy changes that they gutted going back to the 90s, starting with deregulation. We had Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall happened because Ferdinand Pecora put together what Wall Street did to create the Great Depression, and we realized you can't gamble with other people's money. You can't have deposits in commercial banks and use that to speculate on an assortment of things that you can actually create all sorts of fraudulent enterprises for. That was the Great Depression. And Ferdinand Pecora was assigned by the Republicans first. He came up at the time of the transition between Hoover and FDR, and he did what was known as the Pecora hearings, and he laid out all of the secrets and all of the methodology of what all the CEOs on Wall Street were doing with shorting and insider trading and all sorts of financial fraud to steal and set people up and then blow up the whole thing. And then they were the ones standing in the breadlines for the handouts, not breadlines really. I was using that metaphorically, but for the emergency loans from the Federal Reserve, which were created to basically become, the Federal Reserve was created to become the lender of last resort, just in case we have all sorts of problems in the economy that we have to stabilize to keep the ship afloat. It's the lender of last resort. That's the idea. And that's what Katie Porter apparently is unaware of, and unaware of probably the evolution in the role of the Federal Reserve and context to what the Pecora hearings laid out. And interestingly enough, it led to the Securities and Exchange Act of 33 and 34 that created the cops on the beat to make sure that Wall Street couldn't deceive through deceptive acts and practices. investors so that they blow up the world based on a Ponzi scheme. Okay, there's a lot more to it, but that's effectively it. And ultimately, we created what was known as the Glass-Steagall Act. Glass-Steagall separated commercial banks from investment banks, so financial industries couldn't gamble with other people's money. Okay, that was the whole thing of the Great Depression, which led to World War II, which led to 70 million dead, and then we had to reboot the world, of which now we seem to be at the last phases of what that time period created because of everything that happened that led right back to where we were, because of deregulation that took place in the late 90s, starting with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act that basically defanged Glass-Steagall. Then we created the Commodity Futures Trading Organization and all of the laws that deregulated derivatives trades so that they could create this incredible this casino of deception. And it's all predicated on asymmetric information. Who's holding the cards? Who's holding the information? Who's selling? Who's what? Because most people think that there's stopgaps, that there's regulations, that there's cops on the beat to prevent what it was that took place. But that didn't happen because they defanged the police. They created the 3 Ds: deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization, which led to lawlessness in our financial industry that betrayed supply and demand, that betrayed the fundamentals, that betrayed underwriting, that betrayed the stopgaps, that led to a global calamity that is monumentally bigger than all of the other frauds that we've seen through crypto and Bitcoin and all of those things recently. But out here in the ether behind us is potentially the everything bubble, which is being affected by these interest rates. And that's why everybody's looking to the Fed, because the higher the interest rates go and they pop the bubble of the everything bubble, from what I've seen based on the debt, and we're all talking about $31 trillion of debt, but it's global. And, because of the rates of currency exchanges and so on and so forth, if the dollar goes higher, then everybody else's, global debt goes higher. And then, because everybody's on the thread that, it leads to more poverty, it leads to more homelessness, it leads to more calamity, it leads to more upheaval, it leads to just a complete train wreck. And that's what we've been living through for the last 20 years and on overdrive the last 13 years because of Fed policy that Katie Porter is not aware of. So I'll bring this full circle and I'll make my case, and hopefully this will fill in the blanks for a lot of people. So recently I called out, and I've been paying attention to this thing called title lock, which is a total, it's unbelievable. So title lock seems to be the development or the creature of a guy who's formerly of the FBI who understands title fraud, which means he understands also mortgage fraud, which means he understands straw buying and a whole litany of different schemes that people in the real estate market can create all sorts of deceptive tactics to steal from somebody who actually owns a home or has equity in a home, using documentation fabrication to ultimately go to a bank and get a loan, or go to the registry of deeds and get title to that house and then sell the house. All sorts of manners of calamity that I learned about a long time ago. But as it turns out, this sort of fraud has been really around ever since we created lending, and maybe even long before that, quite frankly. There's always been an undercurrent of real estate fraud throughout history. But the whole purpose of the United States was to create an atmosphere where anyone could own their own property, which was a very big deal coming out of course, the 17th century and, imperialism and aristocracies and, feudal system and all of that kind of thing, and serfs. I mean, that's history, right? So if you can own your own land, think about, for example, some of the movies you've seen of the pioneers that come to the United States. They're in search of American dream. They go west and they sacrifice everything to homestead and get their own land. I mean, that's the story. That's the original American dream. And so we created the registry of deeds to be able to make sure that anyone who owns a plot of land, it can be confirmed by the county, by the registry, the states, and so forth. So what this title lock ends up showcasing is that indeed criminals can steal your home or your equity, and they can make your life miserable. They could even possibly lead to a foreclosure where you're left holding the bag. Okay, that's the way they set this up. And they show you all the techniques, and they talk to some of the criminals that went away for it for a while, and they make you believe that the guys that are involved with this are two-bit hustlers that have figured a way to work around the system. And it's geared primarily towards white people. So on the board of directors, and it looks like they're endorsers, I should say. You have literally Newt Gingrich, former Republican Speaker of the House and K Street lobbyist and influencer extraordinaire, particularly to seniors that are white. You have Glenn Beck, who was up in arms about the 2008 great financial crisis. And honestly, I've heard Glenn Beck do things where it's like, God, he gets it, and then he goes off into Looneyville. I actually have heard Glenn Beck talk about the $29 trillion Levy study, and then he connects it to another $50 to $60 trillion that I'm not really aware of, that he thinks he's aware of because he's not following, but I'm not a student of Glenn Beck. I just, see him on occasion, and every once in a while he hits the right, point, but then he doesn't understand the bigger story. And if he does, then he's hiding it for this reason that I'm laying out to you. Then there's Rudolph Giuliani. Again, this is extraordinary to me because Rudolph Giuliani and all things Trump, and we've all seen the meme of Rudolph Giuliani sweating, looking like this melting vampire. And he's gone from America's mayor, the guy with the bullhorn at the at 9/11 and the leadership and everything else, and going back to the 70s where he was the was he the head of the was he the DA first? I'm not sure if he became the AG of the state of New York, but I think it was the DA of Manhattan. He was in a senior position, but he spearheaded and created RICO statutes to enforce and take down the mob, racketeering, influence, corrupt organization. And so here is this guy that has this long history of being sharp on it and all of these other things to ultimately become the melting vampire. We make fun of him because he's a cartoon character. Again, I tell you, these guys come out of Gotham, but Giuliani particularly, being what he is and being involved with Trump in all things, shape or form, particularly in Ukraine and money laundering, everything else because of Donald Trump, it appears to be what it looks like, that he's getting his peace in his old age. And the guy's been married like, 3 or 4, maybe 5 times? I don't know. His character is a mess. He's a mess. I think he was drunk throughout the 2020 elections. And he was involved, as we find out, through, most of the investigation I've heard from Rachel Maddow is that the documentation electoral certification fraud that was trying to use, because the Electoral College, these guys that were certifying Donald Trump's victory when they knew that he didn't get the votes. And that's part of the big lie, which I'll circle back to. So those are the first 3 characters. And there's also Ben Shapiro, who, of course, is like on social media, Mr. Conservative guy. And then, of course, at the apex of this, and his picture is up front and center, Fox's favorite ski-on, Mr. Sean Hannity. So these guys are all involved with Title Lock. And, as it turns out, I have information from an investigator who actually fed a lot of information to the FBI based on the stuff that we reveal in the con that has given me information on Sean Hannity and his involvement with predatory developments. And that would be a little bit problematic, considering what he's pumping, which is he's a schemer, he's a grifter. They're all grifters. And so the thing is, what they're doing is they're taking a piece of truth and they're exploiting it through fear porn. And here's the really interesting aspect of this, if that wasn't enough. They show you all of the different methodologies of what can happen to steal your house through the Registry of Deeds. And then they bought airtime on all of these different affiliates around the United States, where, I come from, a small market. I mean, I was in LA big, and then I was in Hollywood, and then I went to a small market. I became an independent producer, and that led me on this journey. But, I've worked in small market television, and these guys, station managers, like, hey, we got this new infomercial. The way we're going to sell it is we're going to, for airtime, we're going to do what they would call lead-in bonus features on the news, okay? On the news, where you expect to get the information that's accurate, that you can depend on. So this is blended with this information that they're getting out there through this Title Lock, okay? And these newscasters are reading from a script, and they're telling their audience that, oh my God, there's like this incredible fraud scheme that could steal your house. And then they talk to an expert that says what's going on, and they disguise it as a news story. And in that news story, there are affiliates that are tied to, and I think many of us have seen this with the Sinclair stations where they're reading from a script and they're repeating, information that they're being told to talk about, which is just pure propaganda. And thank God for, I guess, the internet that we can put that together and see it for what it is. But in this particular case, again, it's an infomercial. These stations are taking money from this client, Title Lock, with all of these names, and they're probably through Sinclair stations, to be quite frank with you, and they're, advertising this insurance, which is a great idea, quite frankly, given what we know, but they're targeting it to white people who own their home, who don't have to make any payments, to let them know that they can insure their house. Because why? The target market is that A, this actually exists, this is going on. B, they can afford $20 a month for this infrastructure, and I'm sure they do good work. I mean, if I'd like to know if somebody puts in documentation on my home in the Registry of Deeds when that happens, and be notified so I can deal with it. But it's like, okay, why isn't the Registry of Deeds dealing with it first and foremost? And then, well, I know, because they have. I went to John O'Brien and Jeff Dickpen in Massachusetts, the oldest Registry of Deeds in the United States, Salem, Massachusetts, and Jeff Dickpen in North Carolina. And both of these guys are whistleblowers to all of the illegal documentation fraud that not just small level players are involved with. But here's the whole point. The financial system, the banks and their servicers, the whole fucking thing, the too big to fail banks, Wells Fargo, Chase, Bank of America, Goldman and their affiliates and more, and all of these different actors have been involved with documentation fraud that is stealing homes through the Registry of Deeds, that is used in courts to illegally foreclose on all people, all manners of people, not just white people, black people primarily that were targeted, and I'll circle back to that in a minute. But I've got that information. I've got over hundreds of thousands of pieces of evidence that also revert back to what was known as robo-signing. Maybe if you came out of the time period of the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, you might recall hearing about robo-signing. And maybe if you knew a little bit more, you'd understand that there was a woman named Lorraine Brown at DocX who was signing on collateral files as a senior VP of LPS to basically foreclose on companies that she had no knowledge of what she has to have knowledge of legally to be able to foreclose on a house. Now, there's all sorts of methodologies of the law of how you're supposed to foreclose on a house, and there's a lot of players that are involved that can come to create a foreclosure, and sometimes it's a servicer, and sometimes it's an alleged servicer. There's so much fraud in this situation. It created this, what I'm trying to get the world to understand, it created this like bottom feeder cesspool of hyenas and cockroaches and vermin that learned how to steal equity, houses, and everything else, just like the people they show in Title Lock, but many, many more, especially in all shapes or sizes and colors, through what's known as straw buying, which is other documentation fraud and fabrication to basically get someone's house information, go to a bank pretending that you're that person to get loans on that bank and walking away. And then the person who lives in that house who got the loan that never knew about it gets foreclosed upon, which happened to Addie Polk, an African-American 90-year-old widow who owned her house for 4 decades, who had it stolen. And she tried to tell everybody, and then the sheriffs came to evict her, and nobody was listening. No one would help her because she couldn't hire the right attorney to stop all of this stuff. And so she was forced to go get her husband's gun and shoot herself 5 times in the chest. She killed herself. I look at it as murder. This is murder. She didn't commit suicide because she was, anything other than put in a desperate straits and being forced out of the house that she owned that she didn't understand to be forced into the streets. And I can assure you, Addie Polk wasn't the only person this happened to. So how does this happen? Well, if you watch The Con and you go to www.thecon.tv, you'll see the engine, the machine, the assembly line of the housing industry, which is probably the backbone of the American economy. I've read figures that the housing industry, accounts for 20% of our GDP. I mean, you can imagine how huge it is to build developments and apartment buildings and condos and houses and so on and so forth. But do you know all of the elements that go into the activity of buying and selling homes? Do you know what happens at the registry of deeds? Do you know about the tax commission? Do you know all of the elements of home ownership? Well, the problem in 2008 that led up to 2008 is no. Most people didn't know all of those elements. I'm one of them, okay? I thought you buy a house, through a broker if you have enough money and you have income and you can get a loan and you can show that you can pay that loan back, and you go to a bank and you talk to a broker and you get approved for a loan and they give you a loan, and then you pay the bank that money and you do it for however long the loan is. And then if you own that house outright, you have a mortgage burning party because you're free and clear of the debt, which is what everybody works for, because they have their families, they raise their families, they go to school, then they become grandparents, and the other side of the housing, economy is, of course, investment or development or any other number of aspects that come from housing, right? But what I just described was pretty much the mechanics of the American dream. And so to do that, the way it really works, particularly as I've laid out and unpacked in the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, is that because of what I said at the outset of this What the Fuck File lecture, Truth Bomb, is that we used to have a systemology of stopgaps that made sure that the value of the house and that people that got into loans and that people who borrowed could afford to pay back, that those houses actually had a specific value. But going back to the late 90s, because of all of the things that fomented, because of Wall Street's influence, particularly in the Clinton administration, they were able to create deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization to where they got rid of these stopgaps, and also Glass-Steagall, where they got rid of this law that had an ironclad difference between the commercial banks and the investment banks, and you couldn't speculate with other people's money. So fast forward to all of these laws were basically watered down and then basically decimated. Okay, but they were really geared towards the financial aspects of smoke and mirrors. Okay, but civil rights laws never changed. So, for example, if you go into a contract and someone lies to you about a contract and you can prove it, they're liable. They could be guilty of perjury. They could be guilty of all sorts of felonies, but they're usually guilty of deceptive acts and practices. And also what's known as, homeowner rights is one thing, but I'll come back to it because there's a specific law that I wanted to engage that is incredibly important within the civil rights, scenario of how these laws protect consumers and citizens for that fact. But so what happened was, in the run up to the Great Financial Crisis, they created, they lowered the box of what people had to be approved for to be able to get loans. And it got worse and worse and worse and worse. Now, just so you know, we've always had a situation and a problem that's been very tough to find the equilibrium of financing and creating the proper risk management in low-income neighborhoods, primarily African-American neighborhoods. Now, the problem with that, going back to really forever, specifically because of Jim Crow and before that slavery, is that African-Americans never had a real clear pathway to the right income to be able to afford the down payments and the loan structures that banks were offering. They were kept out. It was known as redlining. Literally, banks would go around African-American neighborhoods and circle, the African-American neighborhoods, and they couldn't loan there. And so African-Americans were dealing with all sorts of insane scenarios like, loan sharking and whatever else, to get homes. And, there's different versions of what took place in different parts of the country. But ultimately, a group like Addie Polk, many of them migrated from the South to the industrial Midwest during what's known as the Great Migration. And they got jobs in the factories during World War II where they could afford, to put down payment and afford, low-income housing, supposedly, or just houses that, met the threshold of whatever the dynamics of those neighborhoods based on underwriting were. And they had the opportunity, because of changing in redlining, to own their own home. And they did. And so that was one part of the equation. But eventually, what we did was we wanted to the Bush administration especially wanted to create more home ownership. And so there had always been this sort of move to get rid of these regulations, but then also to create what was known as the Community Reinvestment Act, which was to get banks that had branches in these particular neighborhoods to loan in a 50 square mile radius. Now, in terms of low income, that doesn't mean that they can't afford a house, because the houses should be priced according to what people in those neighborhoods can afford. So you can imagine, right? Somebody goes to a 9 to 5 job. Maybe they're working in administration or whatever, or maybe they're working in fast food. Maybe they become a manager. Maybe they're working in an auto shop. Doesn't matter. They're working. They've got income. They can afford to pay back a loan, especially if they're working within the criteria of the proper underwriting, which there are many people in low-income categories who can't, which would create stabilization, which would then do what housing is supposed to do, create a pathway to the middle class. Because the longer you sit in a house, the more it's supposed to increase in value. Now, prior to the late 90s and early 2000s, that number was going up like 2% a year. By the time we get to like 1999, 2000, that goes skyrocketing. Why? Two things. We had the deregulation, but we also had 9/11. 9/11 just completely hosed the economies at that time. I mean, obviously, things are kind of fractured anyway. It's kind of like an early version of COVID, if you will, because of just the nature of globalization. But ultimately, and I gotta fucking tie this up, but ultimately, the Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan lowered interest rates to practically zero to stimulate the housing economy. So this bubble happened, and all of these underwriting standards that had existed for hundreds of years and really thousands of years in terms of just financial systems writ large, just in terms of you loan to people who know they can pay back. And there's a methodology to that, and you can do criteria and collateral and all sorts of things, and you do that in your underwriting structure. So what they did was, and we have this backstop with this mammoth government-sponsored enterprise that was created again out of the Great Depression. You had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they'd become these Goliaths. They'd become the biggest, hybrid corporations in the world because there was always a guaranteed government backstop, or implied is what they say. But what's that mean? So countries like China and Saudi through the Sovereign Wealth Fund and Russia and all countries around the world would seek safe haven for returns, and Fannie would be one of them because of the underwriting standards, and that housing was so important in the United States to our consumption, and nobody's going to go bankrupt on a house, that sort of thing, because if the house is the last thing you're going to stop making payments on, even in dire straits. So it was as safe a place to park capital as there was anywhere in the world, which led to $70 trillion of capital between 2000 and 2002-ish looking for a place to park, and Wall Street was more than happy to accommodate with creating mortgage-backed securities. And those mortgage-backed securities only came into existence. I mean, it was already going on with the GSEs, but it came out of the shadow banks at this time. And the shadow banks are these lending apparatuses that could be hedge funds, they could be private equity, they could be asset managers, anybody that's outside of the fold of a bank holding company and the investment banks. And they created these verticals where they started working with non-bank lenders, which we call pretender lenders, which you heard back in the day if you were around. The big ones were like Countrywide and Ameriquest and Nationwide and a handful of others that were all over the United States. And what they were doing is they were basically retail lending for warehouse loans coming out of investment banks to basically stimulate getting these mortgage-backed securities to the global economy through a variety of ways. Now, the deregulation of the Commodity Futures Modernization Act would enable derivatives trades with no regulation. So that was like the upend of what ultimately became the ultimate casino because of how this whole thing works. So just to compare and contrast, the value of what ultimately took place to create the carnage and the ripple effects of the great financial crisis, the housing collapse was somewhere in the $4.6 trillion range. And then ultimately the derivatives market was 600 to 800 trillion by 2006. But to feed the kitty in the mortgage-backed securities, you had brokers that would basically create, at that point, they called it subprime, leaning on people that may have not had, a great payment history, that weren't, AAA, but they wanted to get them to houses, so they kind of created looser lending standards. But that led ultimately to what's known as liar's loans. Liar's loans would be no income, no asset, for example. People didn't have to prove that they had income to be able to get into a house. So ultimately, we created this bubble where people were buying houses and many houses and flipping them and trying to create rental properties. That's one side of the house. Other people kept refinancing because they were told that their houses were worth more than they were, and that they could do the math and look like, well, wait, I paid my equity all these years, 40 years later. I don't have any other income because I'm stagnant, especially if you're an African-American widow who's living on a pension, fixed income, and you've got increase in all sorts of costs, whether it's fuel, food, got to fix your house, all that sort of stuff. So you're like, okay, I can refinance, and that's a miracle, right? Because I'm earning money from my house that I already own. So that happened. But it would lead to all of these tactics and these schemes of these bottom feeders that would lie, steal, and cheat on documentation fraud to get actual loans from banks, where there were coerced people, or I should say complicit actors in the banks doing this because they were all stealing money, okay? Because it was easy. But the brokers would try to get as many loans in the pipeline by having absolutely no underwriting standards. They'd approve. Why? Because they were incentivized to make the worst loans possible. So they packaged these loans. By the way, to get that loan done, you'd have to have an appraiser come out. Well, an appraiser is supposed to be a stopgap through these UDAP standards, which are these codes that are basic. Look, you got to look at the neighborhood and all of these different sort of criteria to be able to come up with the actual value of the house. But they were told by lenders, warehouse lenders coming from investment banks, that they wanted to increase the value of the house. So somebody in a low-income neighborhood where the house might have been worth, like, let's say $30,000 to $40,000 over the course of the previous 30 years, now suddenly is valued $150,000. How does that happen? Well, because the appraiser said so, which allows lending fraud to happen. So the key vector in this whole thing are appraisal fraud. Now, we have on camera literally thousands of appraisers that were trying to blow the whistle to the FBI and everybody else, saying that the lending companies wouldn't allow them, because most of these guys are independent, and unless they were meeting the numbers of the lenders. So you have the brokers that were also using tactics of predatory lending. They'd go to churches, they'd go to Boy Scout groups, whoever that they fit in with, and they got people that they looked like and sounded like and thought like into these loans, which were predatory loans. And a lot of them were underwritten because there were 40-page documents of scenarios that, had hyper-adjustable rates or negative amortization or any number of things that would change the amount of money that these people were going to have to pay. But see, the lender would say, look, don't worry about it. Or the broker, come back to me in a couple of years when you have to refinance, and we'll refinance. No problem, because your house is going to go up in value based on those two things that I just said. Now, the other stopgap in the whole scenario is the underwriter. Well, the underwriter is supposed to check income and all of these other things, but it was so fast and furious that they were forced not to do their job. In fact, they were incentivized and forced to do the lies and deception, because if they didn't, they'd boot them out and get somebody else to do it. And a lot of times, they'd get rid of the professionals, the people who had been around forever, who knew what to do and what to look for and everything else. They'd fire them, and then they'd move in somebody who just came out of a job, a low-income job where they're getting paid a lot of money to lie. And they just said, okay, approve. So you create this pipeline of fraud, but then it goes through what's known to investors, because they want to package all of these mortgage-backed securities to basically sell to investors. And they do that through the investment banks because of the deregulation I just said, but they have to get the credit rating agencies, which are these huge operations whose entire job is to basically look at loan portfolios and doing the prospectus that they say it's this level of risk for investors. Now, here's the criteria as it relates to pension funds, particular teachers and firefighters and cops and whomever. Those pensions have to be AAA rated. So the rating agencies were approving because the investment banks could choose who the credit rating agencies were, and they made their money because of this. And by the way, the regulators were also paid by the bad actors to do what they did. And so the regulators weren't looking, because they were paid by the bad actors to keep their fees, because that's what kept their budgets afloat. So everybody's getting paid by the criminal syndicate to basically lie and steal and create deceptive acts and practices that then turned into collateralized debt obligations, collateralized debt swaps, insurance schemes, all sorts of manner, shape, or code. And all along the line, we're talking about tens of millions of felonies. Deceptive acts and practices. You're asking yourself, wait a second, how is that possible? Who's supposed to regulate this? Well, at that time, it was the Office of Thrift Supervision. It's the Office of Comptroller of the Currency, who regulates national banks. And then ultimately, you have the FBI and white shoe law firm, in white collar fraud, and then the DOJ, and then the Securities and Exchange Commission above all else, all of which failed. They weren't aware of this. There were guys inside all of those agencies at the highest levels that knew what was going on, tried to stop what was going on, and they got purged, which is what I show you in the con. Not mid-level guys, the top guys. And so ultimately, this stuff is going out of control, setting up people who have been working their whole lives, saving money with their money in these pensions of these lies that all of these investment bankers and these independent middle players are involved with these warehouse lines, selling a fraud to the entire world, that when it blew up, and the way it ultimately blew up is Goldman Sachs knew, because they had a vertical in Greenpoint Mortgage, and they knew what they were selling was trash, and they were doing it on purpose because they shorted the markets. And so they let the word out on Main Street, in the business press, that what the Bear Stearns outfit with coffee, through their hedge funds, all their collateral was worth nothing. So it created a run in what we call the repo markets, because all of the investment banks loan to each other in the financial system in a 24-hour period based on collateral. But all the collateral at this stage was worth nothing. The houses have been inflated to ridiculous amounts that weren't real, and then nobody could afford to pay those revenues. But meanwhile, those revenues had been packaged multiple times in tranches, where there was tens of thousands of houses in tranches that were sold for tens of billions of dollars to investment pools all around the world, and they couldn't keep track of what revenue was attached to what actual asset. Okay? And so ultimately the house of cards falls, and the entire global economy comes to a complete standstill. The Federal Reserve has to leap into action and save the day. But how do they do that? Well, at the time, we were sold that Congress had to approve what was known as the Troubled Assets Relief Program to create liquidity for the banks. And the way it was sold in mainstream media was they were going to buy toxic assets off the books of the banks, and they kind of poo-pooed everything that I just told you and show you in the con at www.thecon.tv in a lot better way that I laid on you now. And then ultimately, all of this stuff is playing out. The world's falling apart. Nobody has liquidity. Nobody can get their paychecks. Nobody can get paid. All of the money is running out of the banks. It's all of this liquidity madness. The whole world is coming to an end. And Obama comes into office because of the Bush end of his presidency, which he blew everything up from 9/11 to 2008, which is all you need to know. And then ultimately, and he put all of these bastards in there, but he kind of carried it through from Clinton. But what happened was Obama comes in to clean this up. He plays his role. They say it's going to be, Congress approving this Troubled Assets Relief Program of $700 billion to create liquidity to keep the engine flowing of the United States and create, liquidity so that people could get paid and move, people with jobs could get paid, and we can, maintain the economy and that sort of thing on its global scale. But meanwhile, as all that's happening, then we backdoor through the Federal Reserve, because Ben Bernanke, the Treasury Secretary, who was from Goldman Sachs, who puppeteered all this shit, with Ben Bernanke was the now then chairman of the Fed, who came in to replace Alan Greenspan, who was aware of all of this madness and chose not to stop it, which he was mandated to do by Congress under the HOEPA statutes, which is a crime in its own right. But when the world blew up, everybody goes to Greenspan and he said nobody could have seen this coming. Meanwhile, he was given all of the information, which is insane because it was his mandate by the Congress, which again goes back to this understanding of, well, is Congress independent? Going back to Katie Porter. No, the Fed's supposed to be responsible to Congress and the American people, but it's not. It's responsible to the financial system that set everybody up. So what it ended up doing through Paulson, Bernanke, and Geithner is that they provided $29 trillion to the too big to fail banks to get liquid, where they paid them back, bonuses and salaries and everything else for stealing and blowing everybody up, and then they bought everything on the cheap. BlackRock is a part of this and everything else. That's been our economy ever since. So it's distorted the markets, it's perverted the markets, and everybody is always looking to the Federal Reserve to save them, because we created quantitative easing on top of what we did with Federal Reserve Act 13.3 to buy back trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of mortgage-backed securities and asset-backed securities to keep the economy going. That is actually manipulated and lied to create these fucking bubbles based on this financial system that was never held to account. It's the largest mob in history. And then everybody's in on it in power because oligarchs from all over the world shuttled stolen funds into Western real estate. And this involves Trump and everything else. I've got more to say on the subject, but what I'm trying to finish up with at this stage of the game is that this is what I've been revealing to you. And we're faced with, at this stage of the game, because Barack Obama comes into power, puts everybody who created this madness in power, they covered it up, his attorney general and his assistant attorney general, both an African-American and a Jewish guy, which is an incredible shame considering the two backgrounds of those particular people, and they covered up Wall Street's theft. Nobody went to jail. They let these guys get away with trillions of dollars of looting, and then ultimately the banks paid $250 billion in fines, of which went through the courts to own the courts to foreclose on millions of people illegally using documentation fabrication that the courts knew about, but they just rubber stamped because they're paid to do it. They're literally paid to get as many cases through the pipeline as possible. And I've sat in cases where I've seen judges prevent defense attorneys, or depending on the situation, if the attorney is handling a plaintiff, but they won't allow discovery to reveal all of this information that I'm saying. And so, for example, with this this title lock with, Sean Hannity is involved with predatory developments all over the country. I've got access to that information. Newt Gingrich could have gone not to the American people to sell them fear porn, but to make a case with the Republicans and everybody else for that matter, that we got to clean this stuff up at the Registry of Deeds because he's aware of it, but he's not. He's skimming. Because does he know that the Federal Reserve is paying trillions of dollars to go through the primary dealer brokers to pay the system, to get the bottom feeders? Probably. I mean, Glenn Beck, I think he kind of does, but Glenn Beck's not that smart, and he's a conservative, so he goes into this other place. And then, I can't speak for Ben Shapiro, but Giuliani? Because in the end, this whole thing was racketeering, massive racketeering. How do I know? Well, because of Addie Polk's death, she led us to a discovery of monumental proportions. We discovered the only RICO conviction of this monumental crime that took place in Summit County, Ohio, thanks to then Attorney General Mark Dan, who found out that the whole thing was a RICO enterprise. Based on everything I'm telling you and then some. It's all in the con, www.thecon.tv. It's all in the new Untouchables. Go online to check out Real Progressives, new Untouchables. It's in my Truth Bombs. You can go to, if you check live, on my YouTube page, you'll see something that we called Deception Owns You, and it's an 11-hour. It's an 11-hour me, Mr. Smith Goes to Hollywood filibuster, showing you all of this information with the experts, where I lay out the entirety of this incredible mammoth con that the entire system has hid from you. There's so much more, and I've spent I don't even know how long. Looks like almost an hour. All right, well, until next time, onwards and upwards.